The German universities of Wagner's youth were in a state of intellectual ferment, the main cause of which was the proliferation of philosophical systems in the wake of Immanuel Kant, widely recognized today as the greatest philosopher of modern times. Kant called his system transcendental idealism. It is transcendental because it looks beyond the world of space and time, which is a world of appearances. It is a form of idealism because it affirms that only ideas or appearances can be known. Science explores things as they appear to us, but must remain forever silent about things in themselves. We can't prove the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, nor can we affirm the existence of an independent reality behind the veil of perception. The world that we know is a world of appearances, ordered by the law of cause and effect. Kant combined this sceptical vision with an ambitious account of the moral life. Reason speaks to us in the language of duty. It tells us what we want to do and also what we ought to do. And since ought implies can, we rational beings must be free. Freedom, for Kant, is the essence of the human condition, the thing that distinguishes us from the rest of nature. And in exercising our freedom, we reach out towards the transcendental, touching it without knowing it. For Kant's followers, transcendental idealism was epitomized in two grand ideas. First, the physical world is a system of appearances, and not of things in themselves. And second, we are not part of that world, but exist on the edge of it, as pure subjects of consciousness. Kant's most influential disciple was Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who expressed those grand ideas in a theory of the self. All knowledge, Fichte argued, begins in the self. The world originates in me, for it is only in myself that I can know it. Laws and institutions, art and music, even the world of plants, organisms, and physical particles, all are ways in which the self achieves reality by acquiring outward form. Hence the world is not material, but spiritual. It is composed of the very spiritual substance of which I myself am composed, since it is composed of me. There seems to be no place for God in this new and aggressive form of idealism. Soon Fichte was denounced as an atheist, temporarily losing his position in the University of Berlin. Fichte's greatest successor, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, began his academic career as a student of theology. He aimed to rescue the Christian faith from Fichte's excesses, while accepting that idealism in some form must be true. Schopenhauer, Hegel's arch-rival at the University of Berlin, is often singled out as the most important intellectual influence on Wagner. But when Wagner enrolled at the University of Leipzig in 1831, the year of Hegel's death, it was the Hegelian philosophy that dominated the faculties and captured the imagination of the young. For Hegel, the ultimate substance of the world is spirit or Geist. Spirit achieves individuality in you and me, but in itself is greater than all of us. Science, religion, politics, and art are attempts by spirit to realize itself in objective form. All ventures of the spirit are movements towards the absolute idea, in which the world achieves full consciousness of itself. In every sphere, therefore, in science, religion, politics, and art, old forms die and new forms replace them. All our attempts at order must meet with their own negation, and so give way to the higher forms that replace them. It is from this idea that Wagner drew much of his inspiration for The Ring. Nothing human is permanent, and all must perish in the spirit's ongoing search for self-knowledge. In the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel added an argument that was to have a profound influence on Wagner, and also on the course of German history, and therefore on the history of the world. The essence of spirit, Hegel argued, is freedom. But freedom is not granted to us as an unqualified gift. Freedom must be achieved, and it is achieved through struggle. Only through the encounter with the other do I gain the capacity to take charge of my actions. And this encounter begins in a fight to the death. Freedom and self-knowledge are obtained when the other acknowledges my right to them, and when I acknowledge the other's right in turn. Freedom is a social phenomenon, and we acquire freedom by compelling the world to recognize our title to it. It is only in the moment of recognition that I become a full-fledged individual with a will, a destiny, and a self of my own. And recognition must be mutual. To be recognized as free, I must recognize the freedom of others. That idea forms the philosophical core of Marx's critique of capitalist society. It also profoundly influenced The Ring, which tells the story of Siegfried's quest for freedom and individuality, and his final self-betrayal when he enslaves the one he loves and trades her for a substitute. Freedom demands respect for the other. Lose that respect, treat the other as an object, and you too become an object, a thing of no worth, to be used and thrown away. Only at the moment of death does Siegfried regain the path to individuality and freedom, but by then it is too late. The reverberations of Hegel's argument can be felt throughout the Ring cycle, in the self-torment of Alberich, who has forsworn love for the sake of power, in the dark underworld of Nibelheim, whose subjugated people are instruments of a will that they cannot influence, in the terrible tragedy of the Valkyrie, in which two suffering humans win through to freedom, only to find that the God who planned this can no longer permit it. After Hegel's death, his followers divided into the old Hegelians, who saw idealism as laying the foundations for the Prussian monarchy, and the young Hegelians, who were for the most part anti-religious and leftist critics of the new bourgeois state. The greatest of the young Hegelians, Ludwig Feuerbach, attempted to turn Hegel's philosophy upside down, or rather to set it on its feet. He wanted to rewrite Hegel's idealist philosophy as a form of materialism, and it was this that inspired his two most influential readers, Wagner and Marx. Feuerbach agreed with one aspect of the idealist philosophy. He agreed that our world is one of conflict, in which we strive to assert our power, to achieve knowledge of our capacities, and to win recognition and respect from others. But he disagreed with the idealist premise. Reality, he asserted, is material, not spiritual. The self is not the creator of the objective world, but simply one of its byproducts. Consciousness arises from life, and life is a material, not a spiritual fact. From this premise, Feuerbach mounted a critique of religion. Since the world is material, there are no spiritual realities. Religion conjures a world of illusions. In the Virgin Mary, in Christ, and in God the Father, Christians idealize aspects of the human condition, endowing them with a fictitious life. They then bask in the excuse that this gives them to be morally inferior to their own fictions. Wagner created the supernatural beings of The Ring on Feuerbach's model. They are personifications of human characteristics, both good and bad. But unlike the Christian pantheon mocked by Feuerbach, Wagner's gods are far lower in the scheme of things than the humans over whom they exert their dwindling authority. Indeed, as Brünnhilde realizes in the great scene in which she announces death to Siegmund, the human world exhibits the virtues that the gods lack, and without which there can be no redemption, the virtues of self-sacrifice and renunciation. Thereafter, everything that Brünnhilde does conveys the unconscious wish to descend into the world of mortals and to share their fate. The core religious idea, Wagner believed, is not the idea of God, but the idea of the sacred. The great Wagnerian music dramas are built around that belief. Although Wagner accepted Feuerbach's view of the gods as illusions born of our social needs, he believed in the sacred as an independent force in human affairs. In an essay on art and religion, Wagner tells his reader that it is reserved to art to salvage the kernel of religion, inasmuch as the mythical images which religion would wish to be believed as true are apprehended in art for their symbolic value, and through ideal representation of those symbols, art reveals the concealed deep truth within them. In other words, religion contains deep truths about the human psyche, but these truths become conscious only in art, which captures them in symbols. Through art, therefore, we decipher the mystery that religion conceals, which is the mystery of sacred things. In all of Wagner's music dramas, sacred moments are framed and displayed in their full human significance. They are moments of sacrifice, like the deaths of Tristan, Isolde, and Siegmund, like the ritualized murder of Siegfried and the immolation of Brünnhilde. And our redemption supposedly depends on these moments. In the unity of love and death, in the willing acceptance of death for love's sake, and in the renunciation of self for other, we glimpse the meaning of human life. We understand that life lived in the spirit of sacrifice is its own redemption. In one sense, this is not far from Feuerbach's materialism, since it presents the sacred as a purely human phenomenon, one that might be looked upon by a god with envy and awe, as in The Ring, but which needs no god to complete it. But it is also a long way from Feuerbach, since it takes the sacred, the spiritual, and the sacrificial as fundamental aspects of the human condition and necessary to our fulfilment. Like Hegel, who had seen religion as a stage on the way to self-knowledge rather than the final goal of it, Wagner sees his art as expressing and vindicating our religious emotions. Art shows the believable moral realities behind the unbelievable myths. Hence Tristan and Isolde and Parsifal are often described as religious works, to be compared in this respect to Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Wagner was to the end of his life a philosopher. All the currents of philosophical thinking that were important in his day, from Fichte's idolization of the self to Marx's critique of the capitalist economy, and from Feuerbach's repudiation of religion to Schopenhauer's theory of the will, left traces in his dramas. There is no work of philosophy that delves so deeply into the paradoxes of erotic love as Tristan and Isolde. No work of Christian theology that matches Wagner's exploration of the Eucharist in Parsifal. And no work of political theory that uncovers the place of power and law in the human psyche with the perceptiveness of The Ring. During the course of writing Tristan, Wagner fell under the spell of Schopenhauer, the last great representative of post-Kantian idealism. Schopenhauer's philosophy fitted the contours of the Wagnerian music dramas, and in particular gave an articulate justification of what to many people was their pessimistic message. But while it is clear that Schopenhauer was of considerable significance in shaping the later parts of the Ring cycle, we should remember that the cycle was conceived, as were Tristan and the Mastersingers, much earlier, at a time when Hegel and the young Hegelians were setting the agenda of German philosophy. During the 1848 revolution in Dresden, when Wagner was appointed by the revolutionary faction to keep watch from a tower, he was discovered at his post deeply immersed in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. The Ring itself is a post-Hegelian work. In the descent into Nibelheim, Wagner gives us an image of industrial capitalism that says more than 1,000 pages of Karl Marx. In the character of Wotan, he presents a brilliant summary of the vision underlying Hegel's political philosophy. And in the drama of Siegfried and Brünnhilde, he unfolds an epitome of the idealist philosophy of self-knowledge. Looking back on this episode in cultural history, we see that Wagner was the true voice in music of Hegelian idealism. But he added a dimension that was entirely his own. Freedom for Wagner was a political phenomenon, but it was also a profound spiritual reality revealed in the moment of sacrifice. He added to all the abstract arguments of the Hegelians the crucial truth that they strove so often to hide, which is that we are mortal beings and that love is a relation between dying things. We must find meaning here and now, not in spite of death, but through it and because of it.
Richard Wagner stood alongside Mikhail Bakunin on the barricades in Dresden in May 1849, one of the culminating events of the revolutionary movement known as the Springtime of the Peoples that rocked the social and political structure of Europe in the mid-19th century. After the failure of the uprising, when Wagner was in self-imposed exile in Switzerland, his fellow revolutionaries accused him of having not been serious politically, saying that in reality he was only interested in making society right for the reception of his music. In the autobiography he wrote many years later, when he had royal patronage to consider and a more respectable persona to project, Wagner adopted this as the full and true explanation of his motivations at the time. But, as is always the case, the truth was more complicated than that. In the years before and after the revolutionary events of 1848-9, Wagner was indeed enthusiastically committed to the idea that society needed wholesale reform and democratization. We are told as much by his actions, his writings, and the ring cycle itself, which he conceived in the autumn of 1848 in Vienna, where he had come under the influence of Ludwig Feuerbach and Pierre-Jean Proudhon. Indeed, in the months leading up to the Dresden Uprising of May 1849, Wagner became increasingly radical, publicly calling for the King of Saxony to abdicate and for the Saxon army to join the insurgents on the barricades. When the uprising failed, he escaped arrest and made his way to Switzerland, where, in 1849, he published Art and Revolution, in 1850, The Work of Art of the Future, and in 1851, Opera and Drama, where he began work on the ring cycle, which on one interpretation rests squarely on a utopian socialist premise about the conflict between humanity and the distorting power of gold. The titles of Wagner's works in exile do indeed bear out the claims of his contemporaries, which he later accepted in full, that his revolutionary ardour was aimed at changing the world so that his conception of the complete artwork could be realized. This is, however, consistent with the ideal of remaking society and its institutions along utopian socialist lines. There's not only no inconsistency in this, but in Wagner's view, the very future of progress in art depended on it. The strong outlines of Wagner's revolutionary socialist principles in the years on either side of Dresden are clear in the articles he wrote. In Art and Revolution, he decried the annexation of art by commerce and the downgrading effect on it of labour, in which people, going wearily from work to the theatre, desire only entertainment. In The Work of Art of the Future, dedicated to Feuerbach, he wrote of the people's collective desire for art that will fill the void of longing they namelessly feel, and which they are denied because true art is usurped by entertainment, appealing to the basest and laziest tastes only, trading on bloated sentiment and sensation, interested only in producing effects rather than conveying philosophical profundity. The longest of Wagner's writings, apart from his autobiography, is Opera and Drama. In the two earlier works, he had described what kind of artwork is required for the ideal society. Now he explored in more detail that kind of artwork, especially in the relationship of poetry and music, if they are to achieve dramatic completeness. Much of the impetus for the Springtime of the Peoples in 1848 was for liberal reform rather than socialist reconstruction of society, which was the objective Wagner shared with those who most influenced him. Greater political freedom and participation, including increased civil liberties and freedom from censorship, and the replacement of authoritarian and aristocratic rule by democratic institutions, were the principal desires of the educated middle classes who engaged in the springtime movements around Europe. They also desired unification of the German states, reflecting a matured national consciousness that wanted more than the Confederation, which had replaced the Holy Roman Empire destroyed by Napoleon a generation before. The working classes were far more radical in their aims, and in various parts of the German-speaking world their activism resulted in bloody and too often fatal clashes with police and the military. This split the revolution, making it easier for the authorities in the various German states eventually to suppress it, though not without having been given a serious fright in the process, which led to varying degrees of reform, and finally to German unification in the decades following. The influences on Wagner that made him a revolutionary were diverse. Ludwig Feuerbach's attacks on religious orthodoxy were one such. The political and economic theories of Proudhon were another. His association with the professional anarchist Bakunin didn't make Wagner himself an anarchist. Rather, his idea of the people, who longed for works of art that satisfied and completed them, resonates with Proudhon's idea that the best form of socio-economic organization is the workers' cooperative or collective. Behind these figures were earlier and less well-known men, the people who made up the left Hegelian or young Hegelian group, active in the decade or so after Hegel's death in 1831, and who therefore were the influences in their turn of the revolutionaries of the late 1840s. They were inspired by Hegel's view that freedom and reason are the forces that direct history along its currents, and that the spirit whose unfolding is the stuff of history itself will conquer everything that is opposed not just to it, but to freedom and reason too. These heady convictions were coupled with their disagreement with the right or old Hegelians, who thought that Hegel had taught that the unfolding of history had come to an end. The young Hegelians saw that the dialectic of history was incomplete, that there was more to come, as proved by the continuation of irrationalities like religious belief and the lack of social and political freedom, a fact manifested by the authoritarian Prussian state. Wagner's own experience of revolutionary activism occurred in Saxony, where the events of 1848 elsewhere in Europe led to calls for a constitution with a free press, jury trial, and a parliament, standard liberal demands and hardly revolutionary except from the point of view of traditional monarchy. These aspirations weren't quite enough for Wagner. He joined with the conductor and journalist Ernst Röckel in signing up for a revolutionary association known as the Fatherland Union, and gave a lecture to it urging closer links between art, especially the theatre, and the people. He had already formed the view that unreformed society stood in the way of such links, and that partial or piecemeal reformation wouldn't be enough. Nothing but a sweeping away of the old order would do. It was for that reason that he found himself on the barricades in the early days of May 1849. There might not have been barricades if the more moderate demands for liberal reform had been met by the rulers of the German states. The King of Prussia was offered the crown of unified Germany, but refused. The King of Saxony dissolved the Saxon Diet and wouldn't talk with the reformers. It was this intransigence that brought moderates as well as the more militant revolutionaries onto the streets. They'd been joined by professional itinerant revolutionaries like Bakunin, but even so they were fewer in number than the Prussian troops that the Saxon king was able to call to his aid. 3,000 untrained amateurs against 5,000 professional soldiers in round numbers, so it wasn't surprising that the insurgency failed, and the revolutionaries either fled or surrendered, leaving about 200 of their number dead. 10 soldiers also died. Wagner was among those who fled, first to Chemnitz and then to Zurich in Switzerland, where he began what effectively proved to be, in total, a 12-year exile from Germany. Röckel and Bakunin were arrested in Chemnitz. Wagner had completed Lohengrin just before the Dresden events and was able to persuade Liszt to have it staged in Weimar. But the earnings from it were small, and being cut off from a regular income, apart from a small pension that a well-wisher gave him, together with marital difficulties and a complicated love affair, at first made it difficult for him to concentrate on musical composition. In its place he wrote prose. The works on art and the future, already mentioned, were the principal outcomes. It was at this time that he also wrote the first recognizably anti-Semitic work, Judaism in Music, in which he claimed that because Jews possess nothing of the true German spirit, they can only produce music that is shallow and insignificant. His creative urge couldn't be silenced for too long. The ideas he had formulated in the autumn before the Dresden uprising started to bear fruit. He had then written a libretto entitled Siegfried's Death, and now added what we now call a prequel, Young Siegfried. Before 1852 was out, he had written the texts for the Valkyrie and Rheingold, and revised the earlier works to conform to them. Because the new works broke so decisively with the operas he had already composed, he needed to explain the departure and the concepts in which it was based. This he did in an essay entitled A Communication to My Friends, stating he was no longer a composer of operas, but instead of dramas, and that he proposed to produce his 3 connected full-length dramas, together with their prelude, in an evening and 3 successive days, making an overall work of mighty proportions. Political revolution might have failed. Artistic revolution was about to be launched. But there was another revolution to come. Wagner wrote the music for the Valkyrie and Rheingold in the years from 1853 to 1856, but the work was interrupted by a new departure and another dramatic turn in Wagner's thinking, his discovery of the philosophy of Schopenhauer, coinciding with his writing of Tristan and Isolde. He was introduced to Schopenhauer's world as will and representation by his friend the poet Georg Hervé in 1854, and it did 2 things. First, it altered his ideas about the place of music in supreme art, and secondly, it swept away his views about society and human nature, substituting a more pessimistic vision that accorded with his own bleaker domestic sentiments and with his disappointments over reform and revolution. The Wagner we now think of as Wagner is the Wagner of the Schopenhauer years, not the Wagner of the Dresden barricades. This leaves us with the interesting question of which Wagner wrote The Ring, as we now have it. Is it the Wagner who wished to reform society, who saw the residual structures of feudalism in the political order and capitalism in the economic order as interfering with the relationship that people can have to art? Or is it the Schopenhauerian Wagner, far less optimistic, no longer interested in remaking society so that a complete art can flourish in it. Wagner said of his encounter with Schopenhauer's ideas that it was the single most important event of his life. This is a large claim, and if taken at face value, must mean that the finished ring cycle belongs to the Schopenhauerian Wagner, in at least the sense that we can't attribute too much in the way of definite traces of the optimistic progressive revolutionary Wagner to it. At any distance from the creation of great works of art, it's easy to think that, in themselves, they are means of liberation for anyone who is receptive to them. Liberation of the heart and mind, of the sentiments, of thought. Liberation from the mundane and the pedestrian. Liberation into worlds of feeling or imagination more copious and enlarged than ordinary experience can ever provide. Wagner's idea of the complete artwork that answers our human need for such experience was at least part, and perhaps the most important part, of his impulse to be a revolutionary in the first place. It underlies his mounting the barricades and his revolutionary writings of the first period of exile. I think it survives the dramatic change of orientation that made him abandon the idea of social and political revolution, and to take up the philosophical revolution of Schopenhauer instead. For if there is one theme that definitely links the Wagner of the barricades with the Wagner of the later works, it's the idea of the expansive and, as it were, holistic experience of art as complete artwork, and of its necessity to the human spirit.
Wagner encountered the work of the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer in 1854 and continued to study and reflect on it throughout his life. It gave him his most profound inspiration, confirmation, and consolation. For me, three massive ideas of Schopenhauer's stand out: that music is a unique art form which profoundly reflects the nature of the world, that human existence is an endlessly unfulfilled striving, and that redemption comes through a change in consciousness in which desire ceases and the boundaries of the self are dissolved. Tristan, Master Singers and Parsifal were conceived under the influence of these ideas. But Wagner looked at his ring cycle in a new light too. He'd already written the whole text and was drafting the music of Act 2 of the Valkyrie, where Wotan despairs at his own powerlessness and wills the end. Only now, Wagner reflected, did I understand my own Wotan myself. He sent Schopenhauer the text of the ring, inscribed with respect and gratitude. In his autobiography, he reports that Schopenhauer admired it. In fact, the reaction was more mixed. Schopenhauer noted the stage direction at the end of Valkyrie Act 1, the curtain falls quickly, and thought that was a good job, since otherwise we'd see something downright immoral. And he said to a third party, "Thank your friend Wagner for sending me his Nibelungs, but he should give up his music. He has more genius as a poet. I, Schopenhauer, remain faithful to Rossini and Mozart." Schopenhauer proclaims that whatever comes and goes in human history is so much irrelevant froth. Humanity has a timeless place in the world order, timeless and basically hopeless, and no human action can ever really change it for the better. This earned Schopenhauer fame as the philosopher of pessimism, though that was not a title he gave himself, nor was the fame easy to come by. He first published The World as Will and Representation in 1818, but it was only with a popular collection of essays in 1851 that he found a public. Gradually, the middle classes, artists and intelligentsia of Europe and America started to read him. Caught early in this spreading wave, Wagner was very much of his time. He was able to transcend it once he realized how Schopenhauer's alarming kind of redemption was precisely what his own dramatic characters needed. In Schopenhauer's world, there is no God, no absolute being or divine purpose. Nietzsche called him the first admitted and uncompromising atheist among German philosophers. Schopenhauer's question was, does existence have any meaning at all? The prospects initially looked bleak. Full of unresolved desire, suffering and boredom, with no point outside itself, life is essentially in vain, a form of Nichtigkeit, or nothingness. Life is in need of some redemption, but there's no divine order to provide it. For Schopenhauer, the world has two contrasting aspects. First, the world as representation, the world's manifest image, the way we ordinarily experience it, a world of separate things and events arranged in space and time. Then, beyond our ordinary experience, the world as it is in itself, the single essence of everything. This, Schopenhauer argues, is the world as will. Everything is striving, consciously or unconsciously, tending towards some end or other. We are no exception. Our essence is what Schopenhauer calls the will to life, which drives us to pursue the perpetuation of our existence and the reproduction of our species. However the individual life turns out, whatever our particular goals and desires, all lives are the same. We strive for one thing or another and suffer from not having it. We get what we want, but then feel nothing but a momentary relief, only to find a new desire rush in, leaving us unsatisfied again. And too much satisfaction produces boredom, the odious condition of having nothing particular to strive for. Sexual desire is the most intense form of willing. We think we're yearning for a perfect union with a unique object of love, but that, for Schopenhauer, is an elaborate facade. The demeaning reality is the will to life, an instinctive drive to procreate that works in us blindly beneath the level of consciousness. The genitals, Schopenhauer likes to tell his reader, are the focus of the will. His picture of the blind, unconscious drive that he calls will, overpowering the conscious I or ego, seems remarkably prescient in our post-Freudian age. For Schopenhauer, the Greek myths of eternal punishment eloquently portray our own everyday condition. As long as our consciousness is filled by our will, says Schopenhauer, as long as we're given over to the pressure of wishes with their constant hopes and fears, as long as we're the subject of willing, we will never have lasting happiness or peace. But without peace, there could be no true well-being. So the subject of willing remains on the revolving wheel of Ixion, keeps drawing water from the sieve of the Danaids, is the eternally yearning Tantalus. In Parsifal, Wagner uses another mythical figure, the endlessly suffering Amfortas, whose never-healing wound springs from his own desire, an excruciating portrayal that concentrates the Schopenhauerian vision of human existence back into a single individual. However, Schopenhauer does offer us an escape. Aesthetic experience is an altered consciousness in which we find release from striving and pain. Tragedy is the art form that best conveys an objective insight into the timeless human condition. But music is the privileged form of art for Schopenhauer. Music expresses the will directly, not your will or mine, but the world will, the universal essence of the tensions and resolutions present in willing as such. Music is superior because it can get to the heart of the matter without images, words, or concepts. A musical melody or harmonic progression sets out in a direction, as it were, and strives through time from moment to moment to attain its goal. Long, slow pieces with delayed resolution convey the state of unfulfilled willing. Fast pieces with easy transitions are expressive of fleeting happiness. Schopenhauer may have stuck to his preference for Mozart and Rossini, but many have found Wagner's music the best exponent of Schopenhauer's own views. Music as direct copy of the will, and endless unfulfilled longing as the essence of the world. Wagner's own theory of music changed under the influence of Schopenhauer. Previously he had proposed that drama was the all-important end, music merely a means. By the 1870s he adopted Schopenhauer's view of the primacy of music and wrote about it extensively. He proclaimed music the matrix out of which the whole drama arises, and composed in that way, so that in his later works the orchestra increasingly gains in power and importance. What then of the moral theory Wagner at first found so alarming? Schopenhauer closes The World as Will and Representation with the idea that the only true value in life lies in a state of resignation, in which the will is quietened altogether. Moral goodness takes us some of the way. A morally good person acts out of compassion and makes less of a distinction than is usually made between themselves and others. They see others as I once more, as he puts it. To be moral is to have an inbuilt immediate sense of the suffering in all living beings, not just humans. We refrain from harming them and seek to alleviate their suffering. The paradigm case for Schopenhauer is also the most extreme: self-sacrifice for the good of others, something not unknown in Wagner's works. In compassion, we see through the principle of individuation, which makes us appear distinct from one another. We don't feel isolated or separate. We glimpse the oneness of all expressions of the will and treat all suffering on a par. The moral outlook penetrates behind what Indian thought calls the veil of Maya. Well ahead of his time, Schopenhauer studied and embraced Vedanta and Buddhist doctrines. Wagner followed suit, planning a Buddhist drama called The Victors. He abandoned it, but some of its core ideas were reworked in Parsifal. The ultimate redemption Schopenhauer offers, beyond morality, strikes me as potentially uplifting, but really quite disturbing. As his book reaches its climax, Schopenhauer's intense conviction and powerful prose take on a distinctly religious tone. He speaks of saintliness, conversion, redemption, and grace. Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism all contain elements of the same wisdom, provided one sets aside their accumulated clutter of deities and dogmas. This common wisdom concerns an inner transformation, which Schopenhauer calls the will's self-negation or self-abolition. The individual will is switched off. No longer motivated to pursue goals or flee from harm, we attain an elevated state of resignation and look upon the whole world as if from nowhere within it. The individual character or person is extinguished. This, Schopenhauer claims, would be a blissful emptiness, void of striving, void of suffering. In this state one could calmly accept death, which he calls the great opportunity no longer to be I. Wagner said Schopenhauer's philosophy came to him like a gift from heaven. He found something like a religion that required no God, and a redeeming transformation, a shift in consciousness that takes place inside the individual. In the first of his operas inspired by the reading of Schopenhauer, the main characters, Tristan and Isolde, undergo a radical shift of this kind, one that puts their own existence in question. But I have to say that in psychological terms they really are a Schopenhauerian experiment gone wrong. Their evidently sexual desire for the other is a surface beneath which lurks something deeper than the everyday fulfillment of individual pleasure. So far so good, but in Schopenhauer's world there are two alternatives to this desire's taking its usual course. The desire could be unmasked as a mere force of nature that cares naught for him or her as individuals. That would rob the love object and the satisfaction of their allure. Schopenhauer thinks this happens anyway once the sex is over. Or, on the other hand, the individual could be redeemed by a sense of losing the self altogether, a lapse of any desire for individual fulfillment. Wagner's lovers yearn for the night of their own non-existence, abandoning all separation of self from non-self. They become each other. They are eternally one. They are the world. But in Schopenhauer's world, loss of self is always loss of desire. It's associated not with erotic love, but with a desire-free, dispassionate form of love, like the Christian idea of love as caritas or agape. Salvation comes through losing the self, but only by losing desire and losing attachment to individual objects of desire, not by intensifying both to the extreme. So for me, Wagner didn't really succeed in communicating his opinion philosophically, and as I read the words Tristan and Isolde sing to one another in Act 2, I wonder whether they make sense at all. What exactly is it they are yearning for? But then what a crass question that seems. The words are inadequate. They must be, for reasons Schopenhauer endorses. The virtue of music is, as he says, its complete indifference to everything material in the incidents. The music of Tristan, described by Ernest Newman as almost entirely symphonic, transmits the essence of the lover's yearning and engulfs them in the world will in a way that transcends literal meaning. For a psychological dynamic that's properly Schopenhauerian, one must go to Parsifal. If amfortas is the human condition of unfulfilled willing, Parsifal himself personifies the transfiguring power of the will's negation. He is wise through compassion for the suffering of the other and of all others, but only becomes so at the point of his recoil from the kiss of the seductive Kundry. He renounces desire and redeems everything by this one reversal of consciousness. Nietzsche famously rejected Parsifal on the grounds of its Christianity, appalled at the way Wagner sank down helpless and broken before the Christian cross, as he said. It's often been debated in what way, if at all, it is a Christian work. But we can have the same argument about Schopenhauer, the uncompromising atheist who idealizes the Christian saviour as a splendid figure full of the depths of life, of the greatest poetical truth and highest significance. So did Wagner follow Schopenhauer here? Did he find a poetical truth in Good Friday and the Redeemer on the cross, but with no literal reference to anything divine? Or does Parsifal only make sense if it is genuinely religious? Even if we never resolve this ambiguity, experiencing the full sweep of Parsifal in performance convinces me that this was the moment when Schopenhauer, neglected by his own time and with his sights set on posterity, truly found a place on the world stage.
In what may be Nietzsche's finest and most moving book, The Gay Science, there's a section called Star Friendship, which reads in part, "We were friends and have become estranged. But that was right, and we don't want to hide and obscure it from ourselves as if we had to be ashamed of it. The almighty force of our projects drove us apart into different seas and sunny zones, and maybe we will never meet again, or maybe we will, but we will not recognise each other. The different seas and suns have changed us." This passage has usually been taken to refer to Nietzsche's friendship with Wagner, but even if it wasn't intended to, it certainly fits their relationship extraordinarily well. When they first met in Leipzig in 1868, Wagner was 55, the most celebrated and controversial musician in the world, and Nietzsche, aged 24, was at the beginning of his brief and abortive career as a university teacher in Basel. Nietzsche had become a passionate Wagnerian while he was at school, where he had studied the vocal score of Tristan and Isolde, Wagner's masterpiece that had been premiered in Munich in 1865, and where he'd also got to know and heard parts of The Master Singers of Nuremberg, premiered in Munich in 1868. He was intoxicated by both works and wrote to his former fellow student Erwin Rohde, "In Wagner, as in Schopenhauer, I like the ethical air, the Faustian odour, the cross, death, grave, and so on, not the first qualities many people prize or even notice in Wagner." Came the day when he had a note from a friend telling him, to his astonishment, where and when to go to meet Wagner, and he wrote to Rohde, "I decided to dress very smartly." He'd already ordered a suit from his tailor, and it was delivered later that day. Nietzsche continues, "Right, the man has my things, I try them on, they fit." An ominous moment. He presents the bill. I take it politely. He wants to be paid immediately. I'm amazed, tell him that I won't deal with him, but only with my tailor himself. The man becomes more pressing, The time becomes more pressing. I seize the things and begin to put them on. The man seizes the things and stops me putting them on. Force on my side, force on his side. I'm fighting in my shirt tails. The little man moves off with my things. End of second act. I brood on my sofa in my shirt tails and consider a black jacket, whether it is good enough for Wagner. Nietzsche went in the rain to Wagner's relations' house and found to his surprise that it was a very small party. When he's introduced to Wagner, he's questioned very closely about how he became so familiar with his music, and Wagner makes fun of all the conductors who call blandly to their orchestras, "My good fellows, please, a little more passionately." Nietzsche then describes the impression Wagner made on him. He is a fabulously lively and fiery man who speaks very rapidly, is very witty, and makes a very private party like this one an extremely gay affair. In between I had a longish conversation with him about Schopenhauer, of whom he spoke with indescribable warmth, what he owed to him, how he is the only philosopher who's understood the nature of music. Finally, when we were both getting ready to leave, he warmly took my hand and invited me with great friendliness to visit him in order to make music and to talk philosophy. Very shortly after this first encounter, Nietzsche was appointed to a full professorship at Basel University, an astonishing recognition of what a phenomenally promising scholar he was. At the time, Wagner was living in a house on Lake Lucerne with his then mistress Cosima, later to become his wife, and during the next 3.5 years, until the Wagners moved to Bayreuth, he visited them 23 times, sometimes for several days. He was present when Wagner's only son Siegfried was born in 1869. The visits left him, needless to say, intoxicated. What is more remarkable is how impressed Wagner was with Nietzsche. Cosima reports in her diary, which she began keeping in 1869, that Wagner said to her, "Next to you there's only Nietzsche." Nietzsche, whose general view of women was not warm, found Cosima almost as congenial as he found Wagner, and may indeed have been in love with her. Cosima reports the visits of the person she invariably refers to as Professor Nietzsche in some detail, but vexingly says little about what they actually talked about. But from what Nietzsche wrote during that period, it's clear that the subject of tragedy, its creation by the Greeks and the place it had in the life of their community, and the catastrophic death it suffered at the hands of Euripides, going with the rise of philosophy, with Socrates as the villain, was high on the agenda. Wagner had long seen his task as that of reviving Greek tragedy, and his preoccupation with the relationship between his art and German society continued and indeed ripened in the period after 1849, when he was exiled for what turned out to be 12 years for taking part in the Dresden uprising. But for Wagner things got more complicated. The failure of the European revolutions of the mid-century led him to a view from which he never afterwards deviated, that the human condition is an intrinsically wretched one, and that political action could only provide superficial palliatives. Hence his great poem, about to be turned into a quartet of 4 music dramas, The Ring of the Nibelung, had its ending changed from one of upbeat salvation of the worlds, thanks to the power of human love, to one in which it is unclear that anything at all is saved. And at the same time, Wagner was coming to realise that sexual love, which was always for him the fundamental form of love, was much more a matter of longing than of fulfilment. That is what he discovered in the course of writing Tristan and Isolde. While he was encountering all this intellectual and emotional turbulence, he was recommended by a friend to read Schopenhauer's great work, The World as Will and Representation, and found to his gratified amazement that the Sage of Frankfurt, as Schopenhauer was called, had worked out in relentless detail and at a conceptual level what he himself had come to think thanks to experience and to feeling. From then on to the end of his life he read and reread Schopenhauer's chief work, there's no mention of the other books, countless times, he and Cosima often spending the evenings reading it out to one another. Nonetheless, Wagner had an incorrigibly optimistic temperament. He may have subscribed intellectually and in certain ways emotionally to an overall dark view of the world, but if it wasn't cheerfulness that would keep breaking through, though it was in his private life, it was something grander, which he liked to call redemption, one of the things that Nietzsche came to ridicule about him and his works. However, during those heady Triebschen days, the name of his house on Lake Lucerne, Nietzsche said, 5 years after Wagner's death, "No cloud ever darkened our sky. They were days of profound and cheerful moments," though the subject would often have been tragedy. After all, Wagner was writing the biggest one ever, while Nietzsche was writing his first book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, in which he gives his account of the rise and fall of Greek tragedy and its renaissance in the music dramas of Wagner, and which he dedicated to Wagner. As they got to know one another better, so the last section of The Birth of Tragedy, the long celebration of Wagner's great act of renewal, became ever longer, and when the book was published in 1872 was greeted by the world of classical scholarship with incredulity and ridicule. Nietzsche later came to disown the book, calling it embarrassing and effeminate, while for the Wagners it was the most exciting thing to have appeared for a very long time, and Richard and Cosima snatched it from one another's grasp when their copy arrived. After 1872, with the publication of The Birth of Tragedy and the Wagner's necessary removal to Bayreuth, where visits for Nietzsche were more arduous, relations were never the same, though superficially they remained cordial, and Nietzsche started to develop an annoyingly independent streak, duly noted by Cosima. He enraged Wagner by placing one of Brahms's admittedly least inspired scores on his piano, and Wagner angrily threw it to the ground. "In that moment Wagner was not great," Nietzsche solemnly wrote some time later. He was writing a pamphlet in support of Wagner called Richard Wagner in Bayreuth, and finding it, as we may when we read it, terribly hard going. He was beginning to realise, to his horror, that Wagner was surrounded by sycophants. How could such a person, a stupendous creator with a personality to match, not be? And anxious not to be one of them, though as soon as he was in Wagner's presence, the old charm seduced him again. Added to this was his appalling health, the result of illnesses contracted when he was an orderly in the Franco-Prussian War, and it's not surprising that by the time the first Bayreuth Festival at last took place, in 1876, he found sitting through the performances of the entire ring cycle in the desperate discomfort of the vestibule house unendurable. Nietzsche also showed what a hopeless idealist he was by being mortified at the presence of crowned heads and the cream of society at a festival where the original intention of its creator had been that admission should be free for serious art lovers who would experience the unity that the Greeks allegedly had when they attended their tragic festivals. That had, of course, been Wagner's idea. Actually, he had had still wilder ones than that. But he had the essential instinct for survival which Nietzsche lacked, and knew when he had to compromise, if the ring were to be performed at all, with the hope that sometime in the future it would be staged to the kind of audience for which he had intended it. Relations even now remained superficially friendly, but Nietzsche had outlived his usefulness to the Wagners, and if that sounds shocking, one can only say that they too had fulfilled various functions in Nietzsche's life and no longer could, as star friendship admits. When they met for the last time in Sorrento, they spent the evening strolling by the sea with Nietzsche's appalling sister Elizabeth in attendance. The next year Wagner sent Nietzsche the poem, that is the text, of Parsifal, and Nietzsche professed to be stunned that, as he later put it, quote, Wagner had fallen slobbering at the foot of the cross, and went on to claim that the packet containing the poem had crossed in the post with his own latest work, Human All Too Human, where no names are mentioned, but a devastating attack is launched on the psychological constitution of the artist, or anyway, of the romantic artist. Wagner refused to read the book, saying that one day Nietzsche would thank him for his abstention. From then on, contact largely ceased, though Wagner was perplexed and genuinely worried about Nietzsche's state of health. Nietzsche went on producing books at a flabbergasting rate, finding it ever more difficult to get them published or to gain a readership even. But it was only after the sacred hour in which Wagner gave up the ghost in Venice, as Nietzsche himself put it, that he could bring himself to launch salvo after salvo against his former hero. The climax came in 1888, when he produced the stunning pamphlet The Case of Wagner, and another pamphlet, this one of modified excerpts from his previous books, and called Nietzsche contra Wagner. Then, in the extraordinary autobiographical work Ecce Homo, he paid unbearably eloquent tribute to Wagner. I would let every other relationship in my life go cheap. And above all to Tristan, the work which he always venerated most, and which came back in full force to haunt him in his last days of sanity. That the friendship between these two decisive geniuses was a great force in both their lives, though much more in Nietzsche's than Wagner's, can be granted. But I think that from the start it was largely based on misunderstanding. Nietzsche projected onto Wagner's art, as so many people have, his own anxieties and ecstasies, seen in the most heightened possible form. Both he and Wagner realised that the world they lived in was in decay, and that its central symbols, derived in the largest part from Christianity, no longer served a valid purpose. But while Wagner hoped that his art, in its intensity and seriousness, would transform the consciousness of spectators and listeners, Nietzsche was determined to work out in terms that were partly philosophical, partly historical, even more psychological, and often interspersed with poetry, a view of life which would replace, intellectually and conceptually, the whole set of clapped-out categories with which his contemporaries saw the world. The attempted replacement, to be found at gruesome length in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is a shattering failure. As a cultural diagnostician, Nietzsche has a place of lonely greatness, but the gift of superabundant creativity belongs to the man whom he felt forced to make his arch foe.
The Scottish sociologist Donald Macrae once noted in a crusty 1974 review of Theodor Adorno's book Negative Dialectics that in the Anglophone world the cultural presuppositions of the Frankfurt School, or Frankfurters as he liked to call them, are too alien, too rich and too deceiving for that dialect to be learnt as genuine speech. To be a disciple of Frankfurt in 1974 in South London or Newcastle, he wrote, is as silly as trying to be a Viking or an imperial Chinese bureaucrat. This feeling about Adorno and the Frankfurters still didn't go away many years later, even for Germans. Hans-Werner Henze wrote in his autobiography that during a performance of Wagner's Götterdämmerung, conducted by Karajan in Vienna, he bumped into Adorno with a copy of the thick green study score under his arm. But I really couldn't abide him, especially since the day he'd insisted on singing some of his Lieder to me, accompanying himself on the piano in his flat in Frankfurt, where the furnishings were dominated by crochet work covers. In a series of reminiscences about Adorno, the German music critic Joachim Kaiser, though careful not to downplay him as a petty bourgeois professor and composer manqué like Henze did, still pointed to weaknesses hard to overlook. Adorno's notorious vanity was a protective device, but one that also made him vulnerable, Kaiser claimed. Adorno wanted to be loved by everyone, even by those he personally disliked. The vanity and masochistic narcissism extended to other so-called Frankfurters as well. Adorno is well known for his association with thinkers like Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin and Herbert Marcuse, who developed a body of critical theory, derived mainly from Hegel, Marx and Freud, that excoriated the modern world as a dark place where only a faint sliver of hope in redemption can exist. Adorno in particular often sounded like a demonic theologian with a black dog collar. According to him, society hasn't just become less rational and economically productive, as Marx said it would, but radically evil. If we assume that art relates to our world, therefore, it has to be about this truth. There can be no such thing anymore as affirmative art, no more happy endings, beautiful surfaces, or glowing responses. Any such thing is tantamount to moral failure. Adorno's message didn't make him popular, of course, and it still doesn't. But his criticism of what he called culture industry strikes a chord even today. That is, the blandishments of mass media determined to inveigle us into thinking that we live in a positive and ever-improving world. Unusually for philosophers, even Frankfurters, Adorno placed music at the centre of his ideas. Nearly half his books are devoted to music, one of the most important of which is about Wagner. No wonder Henze bumped into Adorno with the score of Götterdämmerung tucked under his arm. In Adorno's way of thinking, Wagner was the glorious beginning of the end, a great musician whose mythology reflected the iconic world of a crumbling empire with its eclectic architecture, fake Gothic design, and the aggressive dream symbols of the new German boom, from the Bavarian castles of Ludwig II and their flourishing tourist industry to the Berlin restaurant calling itself Das Rheingold. Or more generally, the descent of high culture into postmodernism, the freezing of the world into a static space where art is pulverized into dead, alluring surfaces and time is stopped in its tracks to become a meaningless repetition of the same. According to Adorno, this is what Wagner is really about. His book on Wagner was conceived in the late 1930s and published in 1952. But its importance has been overshadowed by the perception that the few upfront remarks he devoted to Wagner's anti-Semitism in its first chapter fanned the flames of the notorious controversy about the composer that still rages today. But that really wasn't its aim at all. Adorno described it in the 1950s and 60s more than once as a rescue, an attempt to wrest what's left of Wagner's humanity from the forces of history that threatened to engulf him, by which he meant the entanglement of Wagner's reputation with Nazi ideology. The seemingly negative tone of the book has led many of its critics to mistake it for a polemical tract. Even the title of the English translation doesn't help. In German, the book's called Versuch über Wagner, and in English, In Search of Wagner. But the German word Versuch reflects the notion of something a bit more scientific and rigorous, the sense of a text or experiment. And it refers to the book's method, not to any tentative seeking out of one of the world's most controversial cultural figures. The dedication to Adorno's wife Gretel, the marvellous epigraph Horses are the Survivors of Heroes, and references to Walter Benjamin and Max Horkheimer suggest immediately that Adorno isn't interested in polemics or Proustian fastidiousness. He's definitely not in search of Wagner. On the contrary, he claims from the outset not only to have found him, warts and all, but with an almost Wagnerian act of redemption, to have saved him as well. The reader's unlikely to make much sense of the essay on Wagner, as the book should be called in English, without some knowledge of its sociological premise. Briefly, Adorno believes that the modern era is ruled by a contradictory use of reason. On the one hand, the use of reason enables human beings to gain control over their natural environment, to make it available for positive ends. On the other hand, the use of reason enables human beings to gain control over other human beings, to make them available for negative ends, which is to say, the dominance of social rulers. Both these progressive and reactionary tendencies are intertwined. The yearning for happiness in a world of increasing wealth and knowledge is frustrated by regressive interests that drive the intellect into narrow, specialized areas. The more individuals are compartmentalized, in other words, the more they're alienated and susceptible to manipulation. The only hope of reconciliation is a critical awareness of this destructive contradiction and the use of pure theory as passive resistance against conformity. Adorno sees Wagner as a heavily damaged bourgeois individual whose weaknesses are so great and whose capitulation to the forces of reaction is so complete that his very decadence becomes a critical weapon against the powers he allegedly serves. Adorno arrives at this observation after passing through some intriguing dialectical constructions based on a virtuoso use of analogy. Surprisingly, perhaps, he's not interested in the subject of Hitler and Bayreuth, nor does he dwell on proto-fascist traits in Wagner's personality in order to revive the silly cliché that Wagner was a Nazi. Rather, his aim is to offset his sociological premise about the positive and negative uses of reason in society with internal analyses of Wagner's actual music that trace the historical dynamic of the so-called era of bourgeois decline. Instead of identifying Wagner with Nazism, Adorno tries to illuminate the distance between them, the deep descent from the primeval landscape of fascism in the 19th century to the most barbaric recesses of the 20th. The heart of Adorno's book is the chapter on phantasmagoria. This highly involved concept, which Adorno developed with Benjamin in the 1930s, is centred on an analogy between the commodity and the work of art. An important constituent of Wagner's works, Adorno believes, is the elimination in their outward appearance of the human labour involved in their production. Social work, including the act of composing, is effectively disguised and dangled magically before the listener as if it were a wholesome product of nature, like the orchestral passage in Siegfried known as Forest Murmurs. Adorno defines phantasmagoria technically as diminution, the thinning out of orchestral sound, static harmonies, or the pianissimi that are in fact aural images of loudness heard from afar. The music subjected to a vertical and horizontal process of shrinking that creates the impression of endless space, and with it an allegory of the eternal and the mythical. The listener, isolated by society's divisive mode of production, takes refuge in this mirage of eternity. Moreover, it appears to offer him or her pleasure, just as Venus offers the delights of her world to Tannhäuser, only to denounce pleasure as sickness and to confuse the two as if they were the same thing. It even embraces social criticism, but opera producers who see, say, Beckmesser or Mime, as negative comments on the capitalist division of labour are deceiving themselves. These parodies of social alienation and deformity are for Adorno part of the illusion. Wagner's Phantasmagoria pretends to be aware of social evil and thereby creates an alibi for itself which, instead of helping to abolish that evil, actually intensifies it by salving the bad conscience of the observer with an entertaining experience that's incapable of giving any true insight into the problem it presents. The medium of Phantasmagoria is the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art. With this concept, Wagner achieved a division of labour unprecedented in the history of music. His attempt to disguise this fact, Adorno insists, is the dialectical route of music drama. On the one hand, the total work of art is a modern piece of technological wizardry involving an intricate combination of disparate elements and requiring a huge collective effort to produce. On the other hand, its creator deliberately blurs the borderline between its individual components and their modes of production in order to create a replica of a society freed from the ills of capitalism and technology. Adorno shows, quite correctly, how the rationale of Wagner's working methods enabled him to interlock disparate layers of music drama in order to make them seem cohesive and immediate. Adorno also points out, however, that Wagner's division of labour isn't truly collective, but that of the individual whose origins and substance are rooted in the self-same alienation against which the total work of art rebels. Wagner's attempt to combine the arts is therefore a failure in the end. The substance of his work, the metaphysics of yearning, rapture and redemption, rules out collective labour just as his social situation does. This is why, instead of using the antithetical nature of the arts productively, he's forced to mix them into an opaque brew and to destroy their real identity. The apparently seamless form of music drama robs music of its decisive power and turns Wagner's truly humanistic demand for a whole and free society into its opposite, intoxication and delusion. But the ending of Adorno's book is also a happy ending. Wagner's art, he explains, ultimately breaks through the illusions it creates. Brunhilde's horse is a silent, compassionate animal that evokes memories of a bygone age with a power of faith lacking in our own. That black, jagged music in the third act of Tristan makes us aware that the whole power of love has turned into its antithesis in the world in which we live. With Tristan's curse on love, Wagner unmasks the deceptive vision of Phantasmagoria. The language of his works is at the service of a social order against which, nonplussed, he finally turns. He voices the fears of helpless people, which makes it only logical that in later life he became increasingly preoccupied with the hopeless half-beings his music wants to rescue. Goethe's Mignon, the nymphs in Fouquet's Undine stories, the Rhine daughters, and the flower maidens. If Orpheus could curb Hades with the power of music, Adorno is saying, there's a precious element in Wagner's music too that could renew the promise contained in this age-old protest, the promise of a life without fear. Still, no one seriously interested in Wagner can afford to ignore Adorno's astonishing book. Its influence distinguished artists and scholars, including Wieland Wagner, the film director Hans-Jürgen Sieberberg, and the musicologist Karl Dahlhaus. And it probably did more than any other single publication to clear the Wagnerian air in Germany after the Second World War. In a sense, Adorno is trying literally to face the music. There's something embarrassingly unresolved in Wagner's public image and a sinister element in his works that'll never vanish. It's foolish to equate him with Nazism, but it's equally foolish to ignore the mechanisms of history that have implicated him more than any other major figure of the 19th century in events of unspeakable horror. It's in order to overcome this almost insurmountable barrier, Adorno is suggesting, that we must confront Wagner in a rational way that distances us from his repellent social character, while at the same time bringing us closer to his music and what we still feel is important about it.